My name was Matthias Kale. I tell myself this every hour when the bells ring, because that's the only time I can still think clearly enough to remember words. The rest of the time, my consciousness exists as a screaming static of pain and mechanical rhythm, a metronome of agony that measures eternity in brass vibrations and shattered bone. I am embedded in the great clock of the Cathedral of St. Macharius the Unyielding, jewel of Hive Primus on the forge world of Metallica 7. My body, what remains of it, has been surgically fused into gear assembly Theta 7, third tier from the central shaft, approximately 70 meters above the cathedral floor. I know this because I can still see downward through my left eye, the right having clouded over with cataracts sometime in my 43rd year of service. The priests call this sacred integration. The Mechanicus documentation I was forced to thumbprint before the surgery called it voluntary biological component installation. Neither term mentions that I've been screaming for 80 years. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the boy who had a father and dreams, and a future that wasn't measured in the mechanical tolerance of corroded brass gears, grinding against what used to be his pelvis. I was 19 standard years old when the tithe of hours came to sublevel 47, Kappa of Metallica 7's Southern Hive. My father, Gregorius Kale, worked the Prometheum refineries, a squat, powerful man whose hands were permanently stained black from fuel handling and whose lungs rattled like a badly maintained engine every winter. I was tall for a hive-bottom dweller, thin but strong, with dark hair my father said came from my grandfather's side. I had all my teeth then, 32 of them, and I was absurdly proud of this fact. In the underhive, anyone past 30 with more than half their teeth was considered blessed by fortune, if not by the emperor they told us, watched over humanity. They lied about that, as they lied about everything else. Our hab unit was 9 meters by 6 meters, pressed between identical boxes housing 60,000 other souls in our sector alone. We slept on shelves, my father on the lower, me on the upper, and we ate corpse starch rations that came in the same grey blocks day after day after day. But we had something most didn't, a window. A real window, barely 30 centimeters square, that looked out onto the hab block's central air shaft. Through it, if you pressed your face just right against the plastic and looked up, you could see a sliver of sky 3 kilometers above. On my 18th birth designation day, my father had given me his most precious possession, a chronometer. It was old Imperial Guard issue, scratched steel with a cracked crystal face, and it had belonged to his grandfather, who'd served in the Macarian Crusade 2 centuries past. The hands still swept in their endless circle, marking seconds and minutes and hours with a soft tick-tick-tick that sounded like a tiny mechanical heartbeat. Time is the only thing we truly own, Matthias. My father told me that night, his voice rough from refinery fumes. The Imperium takes our labor, our health, our years. But the time inside your head, your memories, your thoughts, that's still yours. Keep this and remember that every second is yours to experience, even if everything else is theirs. I wore that chronometer on my left wrist every day for 11 months. Then the administratum priests came with their selection scrolls, and I learned that even time could be stolen. The tithe of hours was a thing of rumor and dread whispered about in the refectory lines and work shift changes. Every decade, the Cathedral of St. Macarius required maintenance personnel for its great clock. That massive, astronomical timepiece that dominated the cathedral's western facade and was said to be so precise it calculated not just hours and minutes, but the orbital drift of Metallica 7 around its star, the positions of the system's planets, and the holy feast days of 10,000 saints across the segmentum. The priests called it the Emperor's own timepiece, as if that corpse thing on distant Terra cared about clocks. We were told it was tended by the blessed, that those chosen for its maintenance were granted the honor of serving eternity itself, that their names would be inscribed in the cathedral's registry of the faithful and remembered forever. What they didn't tell us, what we learned only when the selection squads came, was that the maintenance personnel were components. Biological parts integrated directly into the mechanism because human flesh, when properly wired and surgically adapted, could regulate the clock's functions more efficiently than pure machinery. The mechanicus had determined centuries ago that a living nervous system could detect and compensate for gear wear, temperature fluctuations, and mechanical stress with a responsiveness that even the finest cogitators couldn't match. We weren't being selected for honor. We were being harvested for parts. I was in the refectory eating morning rations when the priests arrived, 3 robed figures in the black and red of the ecclesiastiarchy, flanked by 6 militarum enforcers in grey carapace armor. They carried a data slate that glowed with the sickly green of old phosphor displays, and they began reading names in High Gothic, which most of us barely understood. Matthias Kale, Hab 47, Kappa 9, 118, male, age 19 standard, designation Gear Tender 3rd Class. I didn't understand. I stood because everyone was looking at me, because the enforcers' hands had moved to their shock mauls, because you learned young in the underhive that when authorities called your name, you answered, or you disappeared into correctional servitude and never came back. Approach for sacred selection, one of the priests intoned, his voice a dull monotone that suggested he'd spoken these words 10,000 times before and would speak them 10,000 times again. You have been chosen by divine lottery to serve the Cathedral of St. Macarius the Unyielding in perpetual maintenance of His Majesty's great clock. This is a singular honor. Your name will be inscribed in the ledger of the faithful. Your service will be eternal. The Emperor protects. My father was at the refinery. I never got to say goodbye. They loaded me and 17 other selectees, all male, all between 18 and 25, all healthy according to whatever criteria they'd used, into a transport with blacked-out windows. We were given no time to gather possessions, no opportunity to send messages. The chronometer was still on my wrist, ticking away the last seconds of my life as a whole human being. As we rolled through the hive toward the cathedral levels, one of the other selectees, a boy named Davros who'd worked the recyc plants, whispered to me in the dark, "My uncle was selected in the last tithe, 10 years ago. He said they don't let you leave. He said you go into the clock and you don't come out." "Then how did your uncle tell you?" I asked, grasping at hope like a drowning man reaching for debris. Davros was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He didn't. His work partner did. Said my uncle screamed for 3 days during the integration surgery. Said they don't use enough anesthetic because pain keeps you conscious, keeps your nervous system responsive. Said an enforcer struck the transport's interior wall with his shock maul, the crack of energy loud enough to silence us all. We didn't speak again for the rest of the journey. The Cathedral of St. Macarius, the Unyielding, rose before us like a mountain of stone and brass, its spires clawing at the smog-stained sky, its walls thick enough to house tanks, its windows depicting scenes of conquest and slaughter in stained glass that glowed with filtered light. The great clock dominated its western face, a disk of brass and gold 30 meters in diameter. Its hands massive girders that swept across a face marked not just with hours, but with astronomical data, tide tables, and the orbital positions of 17 celestial bodies. It was beautiful in the way a weapon is beautiful, precise, engineered, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. They marched us through the cathedral's entrance, past 100-meter pillars carved with battle scenes from the Macarian Crusade. Beneath vaulted ceilings so high they had their own weather systems, I could see wisps of cloud forming in the upper reaches where warm air from below met the cold stone above. Servo skulls drifted like carrion birds, their eye sockets flickering with recording equipment, their jaw mechanisms clicking as they transmitted data to distant observers. 10,000 pilgrims knelt in prayer in the nave, their voices a droning murmur that echoed off stone and brass. They chanted litanies I'd been taught in state-mandated devotional instruction. In His name we find strength. In His service we find purpose. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. I wondered if any of them had ever been protected. I wondered if any of them knew that the magnificent clock they came to marvel at was powered by boys like me, surgically grafted into its workings like maggots in a corpse. We were led through a side entrance marked with the Kogan skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, down a spiral staircase that descended into the clock's mechanical heart. The temperature dropped with each level. The upper cathedral was heated by body warmth and burning promethium, but here in the workings, there was only the cold of uninsulated metal and stone. The air smelled of machine oil, ozone from electrical systems, and something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify then, but would later understand was the smell of unwashed bodies trapped in machinery for decades. In a preparation chamber, they stripped us and performed examinations. A tech priest, his flesh more metal than meat, his eyes replaced with clicking optical sensors, his voice a mechanical buzz through implanted Vox speakers, inspected each of us with instruments that clicked and hummed. "You," he said, his mechanical eyes focusing on me with the sound of grinding gears. "Vertebrae show good stress tolerance. Nerve density above average. Bone structure acceptable. You will be assigned to Gear Assembly Theta 7, Chime Vibration Regulation. The pain threshold is extreme, but you have the physiology to survive initial integration. 68% survival rate past the first year. The Omniseer provides." I didn't know what most of those words meant. I didn't understand that he'd just given me a death sentence with a coin flip chance of lasting 12 months. "I want to go home," I said. My voice sounded like a child's voice, small and lost. "I want to see my father." The tech priest's head rotated toward me with a servo whine. "You misunderstand your circumstances, biological component Matthias Kale. You are now property of the Cathedral of St. Macarius and the Adeptus Mechanicus pursuant to Tithe Regulations 4-7, Gamma as ordained by the Administratum of Metallica 7. Your service begins immediately and terminates only upon complete biological failure. You will see no one. You will leave this structure never. You are a cog in the Emperor's great work now." He paused, his Vox speakers clicking as if considering whether to offer comfort, then added, "They told you the Emperor protects. The theological accuracy of that statement is not within my purview to evaluate. What I can confirm is that standard mortality rates for your position are 94% within 10 years. The remaining 6% achieve functional biological stability and continue indefinitely. Prayer's effectiveness against these statistics has shown no measurable variance." Then they took me to surgery. They strapped me to a surgical frame in a chamber that smelled of chemicals and burnt metal. The frame was adjustable. After the first few hours, I understood it was designed to position bodies at any angle needed to access specific body parts for removal or modification. I could see the clock's interior through the chamber's viewing port, a vast mechanical cavern of turning gears, each one larger than a transport, their teeth grinding together with a bass rumble that you felt in your chest more than heard. Catwalks crisscrossed the space, and on nearly every gear I could see things. Human-shaped things. Bodies, or parts of bodies, integrated into the machinery, some moving with the gear's rotation, others stationary but clearly alive based on the occasional jerking movement or the way feeding tubes pulsed with nutrients being pumped into biological tissue. "The anesthetic we provide is minimal," a Medicae servitor explained, its voice the flat monotone of a lobotomized human reprogrammed for medical service. "Pain maintains consciousness. Consciousness maintains nervous system responsiveness. Responsive nervous systems properly regulate mechanical systems. Therefore, pain is functionally necessary for optimal integration. The Omniscire's wisdom is perfect." They gave me a rubber block to bite on. Later, I would understand the dark irony of this. They were worried about me biting through my tongue, not about the agony they were about to inflict. The surgery took 11 hours. They began by removing my legs at mid-thigh. I felt the circular saw's teeth catch on my left femur, felt the vibration travel up through my pelvis and spine, felt the wet snap as the bone finally parted. The Medicae servitor cauterized as it cut. and the smell of my own burning flesh was somehow worse than the pain, because it was undeniable proof that this was happening, that my body was being disassembled like a broken machine. My right leg followed. I screamed into the rubber block until my jaw muscles cramped. Leg removal saves space and reduces metabolic requirements, the servitor noted, as if reading from a manual. You will be fed intravenously. Waste elimination will be handled through catheterization. Biological maintenance will be automated. You need only provide nervous system functionality. With my legs gone, they rotated the frame until I was vertical, then lowered me into gear assembly theta 7. The gear was approximately 4 meters in diameter, its teeth worn smooth from a century of operation, and it rotated once every 30 seconds as part of the clock's hour-striking mechanism. They'd cut a cavity into the gear's hub specifically sized for a human torso, and they wedged my body into this space with my back against brass that was warm from friction and my chest exposed to the cold air of the clock chamber. Then came the nerve wiring. They inserted electrodes into my spinal column at intervals from my tailbone to my brainstem. I counted 17 insertion points, though I lost consciousness 3 times during the process and may have missed some. Each electrode was connected to sensor equipment embedded in the gear assembly. The tech priest explained, his voice detached and clinical, that my nervous system would now detect variations in the gear's rotation speed, temperature, and stress patterns. My brain would process this information unconsciously, and my body would respond with minute electrical impulses that fed back into servo motors that made micro-adjustments to the clock's balance. I wasn't operating the clock. I was part of its feedback system, a biological sensor suite wired directly into the mechanism. But the worst part, the part that would define the next 80 years of my existence, was the chime connection. Gear assembly theta 7 was directly linked to the cathedral's hour bells, 17 bronze giants, each weighing several tons, that struck every hour to mark time across the entire hive sector. When the bells rang, the vibration traveled through the clock's mechanical structure, directly into the gear I was fused with. And they'd wired my nervous system directly into that gear. Initial chime exposure is often traumatic, the tech priest noted, consulting a data slate. Biological components frequently experience dental fracturing, temporary loss of consciousness, involuntary muscle spasms, and extreme pain. Adaptation period averages 3 to 8 weeks. Those who survive the adaptation period show decreased response to stimuli, suggesting successful neural accommodation. He didn't say successful like it was a good thing. He said it like a mechanic describing an engine that had been broken in. They finished the integration by sealing the cavity with a metal plate bolted directly through my ribs into the gear's structure, leaving only my head, arms, and upper torso exposed. My arms hung uselessly. I couldn't reach anything, couldn't leverage against anything, couldn't move more than a few centimeters in any direction. The chronometer was still on my left wrist, tick-tick-ticking. A tech priest noticed it, reached toward it as if to remove it, then paused. Irrelevant, he concluded. It will cease functioning within 6 months due to gear lubricant exposure. Let the biological component retain this comfort object. It changes nothing. Then they activated the clock, and I learned what the next 80 years would feel like. The gear began to turn with a grinding lurch that pulled at every connection point in my spine. I was rotating slowly through the dark mechanical space, my body locked in place while the world revolved around me. Every 30 seconds, my position changed. Sometimes I was upright, sometimes tilted at angles, sometimes nearly inverted. The motion was slow enough that I didn't get dizzy, but constant enough that I never had a moment of stillness, never had a reference point that wasn't moving. Other gears ground past me in the darkness, and I could see them now. The other components. The other humans integrated into the mechanism. On a gear 2 meters to my left, a boy about my age was fused in a similar configuration, his face gray with shock, his eyes wide and staring. His mouth moved constantly, but no sound came out. I think they'd damaged his vocal cords during surgery, or perhaps he'd simply screamed until his voice gave out. Every 30 seconds, as our gears meshed and separated, we'd make eye contact, and I could see my own horror reflected in his eyes. Further up, in the clock's upper assemblies, I could see older components. Bodies that had been integrated for years or decades, their exposed skin gray and covered with machine grime, their limbs atrophied to bone-thin appendages, their heads lolling or held rigid by cervical clamps. Some still had human eyes that tracked movement. Others had eyes that were clouded, or empty, or had been replaced with optical sensors. How many boys had been fed into this mechanism? How many bodies were locked into these gears, their nervous systems slaved to brass and steel? I tried to count them and lost track after 50. The chamber was too large, too complex, and too dark to see every assembly. I'd been turning for approximately 47 minutes. I was still conscious enough to track time, still aware enough to count the revolutions and calculate duration, when the cathedral clock reached the hour. The bells rang. I don't have adequate words to describe what that felt like. The closest comparison would be if someone took your spine and used it as a tuning fork, striking it with a hammer and letting the vibration resonate through every nerve ending in your body simultaneously. The sound was beyond sound. It was a physical force that entered through the gear and transmitted directly into my skeleton. My teeth shattered, all of them, simultaneously. I felt each one crack and fragment, felt the pieces cut my gums and tongue, felt my mouth fill with blood and enamel shards. The pain from my teeth was nothing compared to the pain from my spine. Every vertebra felt like it was vibrating itself apart, like the bone was trying to shake itself into dust. My vision went white, not from unconsciousness, but from the sheer overload of sensory input. I screamed. Blood and tooth fragments sprayed from my mouth. I screamed until I had no air left, and then I gasped and screamed again. The bells rang 17 times, once for each hour since the local planetary midnight. 17 separate hammer blows to my nervous system. 17 eternities of white-hot agony. When they finally stopped, I hung limp in my restraints, blood streaming from my mouth, my entire body trembling with aftershocks. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. I realized dimly that I might be partially deaf now, that the vibration had damaged something in my inner ear. The boy on the gear next to me was unconscious, blood running from his nose and ears. Further up in the mechanism, I could see other components in similar states of trauma, some still conscious and sobbing, others limp, one convulsing so hard that I could see his restraints cutting into flesh. And somewhere in the mechanical darkness above, I heard laughter. Not human laughter, the clicking, buzzing approximation of laughter from a tech priest's Vox speakers. Our chime integration successful, a voice echoed through the chamber. 17 of 18 biological components survived initial exposure. 1 cardiac failure on gear assembly Delta. 3 replacement will be requisitioned from the next tithe cycle. The Omnissiah provides. Proceed to automated maintenance protocols. 17 of 18. One of us had died in the first hour. His heart had simply stopped from the trauma. I would later learn that was the lucky one. My chronometer was still ticking. I could see it on my wrist, the hands still sweeping their endless circle. 3 hours had passed since the surgery began. I had been a component for 3 hours. I would be a component for 800 and more years more. The tech priests had said adaptation took 3 to 8 weeks. They were correct in a terrible literal sense. Adaptation didn't mean the pain lessened. It meant you learned to exist inside the pain the way a man in a burning building learns to exist inside fire. Not comfortably, not peacefully, but with the animal understanding that this is reality now and you either function within it or you die. Many chose to die, or tried to. The boy on the gear next to me, his name was Petros, I learned later, though by then he'd forgotten it himself, attempted to bite through his own tongue 3 days into integration. He succeeded in tearing most of it off before the automated medical systems detected the hemorrhage and deployed Medicaid servitors to cauterize the wound. They didn't give him a new tongue. They just sealed the wound and left him mute, fed him through tubes, and he continued to function as a component. The clock didn't care if you could speak. Another component, somewhere in the upper assemblies, managed to work one arm free of his restraints through weeks of gradual manipulation. When he finally got loose, he used his freed hand to tear the neural interface from his spine. The shock killed him instantly, a mercy considering the alternatives. They removed his corpse during a maintenance cycle and installed a replacement from the next tithe batch 6 days later. I discovered you couldn't kill yourself by holding your breath. I tried repeatedly in the weeks after integration. Your body betrays you. It forces you to breathe, forces you to continue, forces you to survive even when survival is worse than death. The autonomic nervous system is designed to keep you alive regardless of your conscious wishes. In my case, that design flaw meant 80 years of consciousness inside a prison of brass and pain. The bells rang every hour, every single hour. 17 strikes when the clock matched local planetary midnight, 1 strike for 1 o'clock, 2 for 2, and so on through the diurnal cycle. Each time, my teeth broke again. They'd been shattered in the first chime, but they tried to heal. Human biology is persistent that way, and each time they started to knit back together, the next chime would fracture them again. My mouth became a permanent wound, my gums receded from infection and trauma, and eventually there was more scar tissue than original tissue. I learned to keep my jaw clenched during chimes to minimize the damage, but that just meant the vibration shattered my teeth while they were pressed together, the fragments grinding into each other like stones in a mill. The pain from the chimes was consistent, white-hot, all-consuming, nauseating. But I learned to anticipate it. My nervous system, wired into the clock's mechanism, could feel the gears shifting into chime position about 30 seconds before the bells rang. This was worse than the pain itself in some ways. 30 seconds of mounting dread, knowing exactly what was coming, unable to do anything but wait and feel the terror build. Then the hammer blow of vibration, the destruction of my body from the inside out, the screaming that I couldn't stop because screaming was the only response my nervous system had to stimulus that extreme. Then 59 minutes of recovery before it started again. Every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year. My father's chronometer stopped working in month 7, just as the tech priest had predicted. The machine oil and lubricant that filled the air of the clock chamber had corroded the mechanism. I watched the second hand slow, stutter, and finally stop at 43 seconds past 9 minutes past 3 o'clock. It would never move again. I cried when it stopped, real tears running down my face through the grime and machine oil. I cried because that chronometer had been my last connection to my father, my last proof that I'd had a life before this. And now it was just a dead weight on my wrist, a reminder that even the things meant to mark time eventually stop, while I kept going. Somewhere in year 3, though I may be wrong about the timeline because time becomes strange when you exist in hour-long cycles of pain for years without variation, I noticed the pilgrims for the first time. The clock chamber had viewing ports at various levels where the devout could observe the sacred mechanism at work. These ports were sealed with thick armor cries, and the viewers stood in climate-controlled observation chambers on the other side, peering through into our mechanical hell like visitors to a zoo. They came to marvel at the Emperor's timepiece. They came to pray before its precision. They came to witness, as the guide servitors would intone, the blessed mechanism tended by the faithful, their service eternal and their devotion absolute. I could see them sometimes as my gear rotated me past a viewing port, well-fed faces from the upper hive, clothed in clean robes, their eyes wide with what they interpreted as holy wonder. Children pressed their faces to the armor cries, pointing at the gears, asking questions I couldn't hear but could imagine. How does it work? Who makes it go? Why is it so big? Did they know what they were looking at? Did they see the bodies integrated into the gears, or had their brains simply categorized us as part of the machinery, no more worthy of concern than a piston or a camshaft? Once, in year 6 or 7, a pilgrim made eye contact with me. Our gazes locked for perhaps 3 seconds as my gear carried me past his viewing port, long enough for him to see my face, my blood-caked mouth, my eyes that I'm certain were no longer entirely human in their expression. He looked away quickly and moved to a different viewing port. He'd seen me, recognized me as human or formerly human. And he'd looked away because confronting what that meant, that the sacred clock was powered by suffering, that his devotions were performed before an altar of flesh ground into machinery, was too disturbing to his carefully maintained faith. The priests had told them the Emperor protects. The propaganda had assured them that service to the Imperium was glorious, that sacrifice was rewarded, that the faithful were cherished. To acknowledge me would be to acknowledge that those were lies, and lies are easier to accept than truth, when truth means your entire worldview is built on the bones of people like me. So he looked away, and I continued to turn, and the clock kept time with perfect indifference. I thought about my father sometimes during those years. I wondered if he'd tried to find me, if he'd gone to the Cathedral to demand answers, if he'd been told I was serving eternally and faithfully and been satisfied with that answer. I wondered if he'd kept working the refineries, if his lungs had finally given out, if he'd died believing I was honored and blessed rather than tortured and trapped. I hoped he'd died believing that. I hoped he'd never stood on the other side of a viewing port and seen what his son had become. In year 12, they installed a new component on Gear Assembly Theta 4, directly adjacent to mine. The tithe had come again, and fresh bodies were being integrated into the clock to replace those who'd failed. His name was Marcus. He was 18 standard years old. He'd been selected from the same Hab levels I'd come from, and he still had all his teeth. I watched his integration surgery through the haze of my own pain and exhaustion. I watched them cut his legs off. I watched them wire his spine into the gear. I watched his face when they told him about the chimes, saw the incomprehension in his eyes, because there's no way to truly understand what it will feel like until it happens. When the first bell rang and his teeth shattered, I watched him scream, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no horror. No fellowship in suffering, nothing except a dim observation that this was happening, the way you might notice a gear needed lubrication or a belt had worn thin. My emotional capacity had atrophied along with my legs, withered from disuse and trauma until I was simply an observer of suffering rather than a participant in it. This should have disturbed me more than it did. Marcus tried to speak to me in his early weeks. He'd turn his head toward me when our gears brought us close, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear over the grinding machinery. I think he was asking questions. I think he wanted to know how long I'd been here, if it got better, if there was hope of release. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, I still had my voice, though I rarely used it, but because there was nothing to say that wouldn't destroy what little psychological stability he'd managed to maintain. So I watched him with the same indifferent attention I gave to the gears and levers, and eventually he stopped trying to communicate. In year 19, Marcus stopped screaming when the bells rang. He'd adapted, the way I'd adapted, the way all the long-term components adapted. His face had gone gray with machine grime. His eyes had developed that same empty quality I'd seen in the older components when I'd first been integrated. The look of consciousness that had given up on anything except existing, through the next hour, and the next, and the next. In year 2003, they installed another new component. Then another in year 31. Then 2 more in year 37, when a mechanical failure caused a partial collapse in the upper assemblies, and several components were crushed. I watched them all arrive young and terrified. I watched them all break and adapt. I watched them all fade into the mechanism, their identities subsumed into their function, their humanity eroded by decades of hourly trauma. Some of the older components, the ones who'd been integrated for 40 or 50 years, had started to physically merge with their gears. Their skin had grown into the brass, where metal pressed against flesh for decades. scar tissue forming permanent bonds. Their atrophied limbs had calcified in their restraints, bones fusing into permanent positions. They were more machine than man at that point, their bodies having given up on the idea of separating from the mechanism. I wondered if that would happen to me. I wondered if in another 20 years my flesh would grow into gear assembly theta. 7. My body literally becoming part of the clock structure until there was no distinction between the biological component called Matthias Kale and the brass component called gear assembly theta. 7. I wondered if that might actually be better, if that final merger might mean some kind of end to the conscious experience of suffering, a dissolution into pure mechanism where there were no thoughts, no awareness, only function. But the components who'd reached that stage still screamed when the bells rang, still showed eye movements that suggested consciousness, still had that terrible awareness in their faces that said, "I'm still here, I'm still trapped. I'm still suffering." There was no escape in merger, only a different kind of prison. In my 53rd year of service, gear assembly theta 7 developed a stress fracture. I felt it beginning weeks before it became visible. A wrongness in the vibration pattern during rotation, a grinding sensation that didn't match the usual mechanical rhythm, a heat buildup that suggested metal fatigue. My nervous system, wired into the gear for half a century, detected the anomaly with perfect clarity. The tech priests arrived with their diagnostic equipment during a maintenance cycle. They examined the gear while I hung limp in my restraints, their optical sensors clicking as they analyzed stress patterns and metal crystallization. "Biological components' neural feedback is accurate," one noted, his mechanical voice flat. "Fracture propagation in gear structure matches sensory reports exactly. Component efficiency remains at 73% despite 53 years of continuous operation, substantially above predicted degradation curves." Another tech priest consulted a data slate. Standard protocol requires gear replacement. However, biological integration of this depth cannot be transferred. Options: euthanize component and install replacement, or reinforce gear structure and continue operation. They discussed this for several minutes as if I couldn't hear them, as if I was simply a piece of equipment whose specifications they were reviewing. Then a senior tech priest arrived. I recognized him by the extensive augmentation and the authority with which the others deferred to him. "Analyze. What is the expected remaining service life of the biological component if gear reinforcement is performed? Data suggests 200 to 400 additional years depending on variables. The component's neural plasticity has exceeded all baseline projections. Cellular degradation is substantially slower than historical averages, possibly due to the constant electrical stimulation from neural interfaces maintaining tissue vitality beyond normal human aging parameters. 200 to 400 more years. I'd been here for 53 years, more than half my natural lifespan gone into feeding this mechanism, and they were telling me I might have centuries more. Not decades, not many years, centuries. Multiple human lifetimes of hourly agony, of bells shattering my half-healed teeth, of slow rotation through mechanical darkness, of watching boys younger than I'd been get integrated and broken and absorbed into the mechanism's eternal functioning. "Reinforce the gear," the senior tech priest decided. "This component's efficiency rating justifies the resource expenditure. The Omnissiah provides, waste not his gifts." They welded reinforcement struts directly onto gear assembly theta 7 while I was still fused into it. I felt the heat through the neural connections, felt the vibration of the welding equipment, felt new stress points form as the added metal changed the gear's weight distribution. They didn't use anesthetic for this either. Apparently, my nervous system needed to remain responsive during the repairs so I could integrate with the modified gear structure. When they finished, one of the tech priests paused before leaving, his optical sensors focusing on my face. "You have served well, biological component Matthias Kale. Your continued function honors the Omnissiah's design and the Emperor's sacred chronometry. Be at peace in your purpose. Be at peace." in my purpose, as if this was a purpose, as if grinding my life into clockwork was something that could provide peace, as if the Emperor, that desiccated corpse on his golden throne, cared about the functioning of this clock or the suffering required to maintain it. They told us he protects. The propaganda repeated it endlessly. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. If he protects, he'd forgotten to protect me. He'd forgotten to protect Marcus and Petros and the hundreds of other boys fed into this mechanism across the centuries. He'd forgotten to protect anyone except those wealthy enough to view our suffering from climate-controlled observation chambers and interpret it as holy devotion. Or, and this was the thought that had been growing in my consciousness for decades now, he'd never protected anyone at all. The phrase was programming, psychological control. A lie told to make the ground down and enslaved accept their fate as divine will rather than systemic oppression. The Emperor protects. 3 words that made suffering bearable by reframing it as service. 3 words that turned victims into volunteers, slavery into devotion, torture into honor. 3 words I would never believe again. In my 80th year, I know this precisely because I'd learned to count days by chime patterns, to track years by the subtle seasonal variations in cathedral temperature. A child stood at the viewing port for longer than most pilgrims did. He was perhaps 9 or 10 standard years old, brought by his father to witness the sacred mechanism. His face pressed against the armor cries as my gear rotated me past his position, and his eyes locked onto mine with that unclouded perception children sometimes have before indoctrination fully sets in. He saw me, not the gear, not the holy machinery, me, the human component. The boy who'd been fed into this clock 8 decades before. And his expression was horror. His father noticed, followed his son's gaze, then quickly pulled the child away from the viewing port. I saw the father lean down, saw his lips moving, explaining no doubt that what the child had seen was sacred service, that those integrated into the mechanism were blessed, that their suffering was holy and their devotion eternal. Rewriting the child's horror into devotion, programming him to see torture as glory, to interpret screaming as prayer, to understand enslavement as honor. And the child's face changed. I watched it happen in real time, the initial horror smoothing out, being replaced by the confused acceptance of a young mind being told that what it sees isn't what it thinks it sees. That authority knows better than perception, that faith requires accepting the unacceptable. In 10 years, that child would be old enough for tithe selection. Maybe he'd be chosen, maybe he'd end up integrated into a gear himself. And maybe by then he'd been so thoroughly conditioned that he'd accept it as honor right up until the moment the first bell rang and his teeth shattered and his nervous system learned what eternity actually feels like. The cycle perpetuates, the system continues, the clock keeps time, and pilgrims keep coming to marvel at its precision. And boys like I'd been keep getting selected and dismembered and wired into machinery. And everyone pretends this is how it should be, because the alternative, acknowledging that the imperium of man is a vast machine that consumes its own children, is too terrible to confront. I'd had 8 decades to think about this. 8 decades of hour-long cycles between chimes, 17,520 hours of consciousness trapped in brass and pain. 632,000 opportunities to watch my thoughts circle and evolve, and slowly crystallize into understanding. The Emperor doesn't protect. The Imperium doesn't cherish. The machine god doesn't bless. These are stories told to make the grinding bearable lies that transform victims into volunteers. Psychological programming that prevents rebellion by reframing oppression as divine order. I am not blessed. I am not honored. I am not serving some greater good. I am a biological component in a clock, no different from a spring or a gear, except that I can suffer and they cannot. My suffering serves no higher purpose. It doesn't maintain the Imperium, doesn't protect humanity, doesn't advance any cause except the bare mechanical function of keeping time in one cathedral on one forgettable forge world in a galaxy of millions of worlds. If I died today, if my heart stopped, if my neural integration failed, if my flesh finally gave out, they would requisition a replacement from the next tithe cycle. Some other boy would be selected, would have his legs removed, would be wired into gear assembly theta 7, and the clock would continue with barely a minute's interruption. I am replaceable, expendable, utterly without significance except as a component that happens to be cheaper than building a fully mechanical equivalent. This is the truth they hide behind the propaganda. This is what the Emperor protects really means. The Emperor protects the system that perpetuates itself by consuming people like me. Which brings us back to where I started. My name was Matthias Kale. I am 80 years into integration with gear assembly theta 7 of the great clock of the Cathedral of St. Macarius the Unyielding. I have no legs. I have no teeth. Only scar tissue and exposed jawbone that breaks slightly with every chime and heals slightly between chimes in an eternal cycle of fracture and repair. My spine is more wire than bone at this point, my nervous system more machine interface than biological structure. The chronometer on my wrist stopped working 73 years ago, but I've never managed to remove it. The band has fused with my skin, scar tissue growing around the metal and leather, and even if I could remove it, I wouldn't. It's the last physical proof that I was once Matthias Kale, son of Gregorius Kale, a boy who had a father and a future, and dreams that didn't include becoming a gear in a clock that measures the hours of other people's lives. In 37 minutes, the bells will ring again. 17 strikes for midnight. My teeth will fracture again. My spine will feel like it's tearing itself apart again. I will scream again, and the sound will be lost in the mechanical grinding and the thunder of bronze bells. And no one will care because this is just what happens every hour, every day, every year. Marcus is still on gear assembly theta 4. He's been here 68 years now. They installed him 12 years after me, and he's endured almost as long. We don't speak. We haven't spoken in decades. We just exist in parallel hells, two biological components maintaining sacred chronometry, our suffering invisible to everyone except each other, and the hundreds of other components scattered throughout this mechanical cavern. New components have been installed recently. I watched another tithe integration 3 months ago. 5 new boys, all young, all terrified, all told they were blessed and honored and serving the Emperor's great work. 1 died during the first week. The others are adapting, learning to exist inside the pain, their faces already starting to develop that gray emptiness that comes when you realize this is forever and there's nothing you can do except continue. The tech priests say I might have centuries left, 200 years, 400 years. They don't know exactly because my neural integration has exceeded all their historical data. My consciousness is too thoroughly wired into the gear to separate now, and my body is being kept alive by the same electrical stimulation that lets me sense the gear's mechanical status. I am trapped in perfect health, my body unable to age properly, unable to fail properly, unable to die properly. This is my eternity, hour by hour by hour by hour, the bells ringing and my teeth breaking and my spine screaming. Forever turning through mechanical darkness while pilgrims marvel at the precision of the Emperor's timepiece and children are conditioned to see my torture as devotion. The chronometer's hands are frozen at 3 hours 9 minutes and 43 seconds. That specific moment is preserved forever on my wrist. The last second before time stopped meaning anything except the duration between chimes. The last moment when I still had tools to measure my life in anything except pain cycles. In the upper assemblies, I can see components who've been integrated for over a century. Their bodies have fused completely with their gears, flesh and metal grown into single hybrid structures, and they still show signs of consciousness. Eyes that track movement, faces that contort when the bells ring. They've been here since before I was born, and they'll be here long after any normal human would have died of old age. This is the Imperium of Man. This is what lies behind the propaganda and the prayers and the promises of protection. This is what sacred duty actually means when you're poor enough, unlucky enough, or useful enough to be selected for integration. We are components, biological mechanisms, suffered flesh, serving to maintain the functioning of a system that sees us as resources to be consumed. And the cruelest part is that we maintain consciousness throughout. We're aware enough to understand what's been done to us, aware enough to suffer, aware enough to know that this is forever, and there's no escape and no one is coming to save us, because no one even knows we need saving. The faithful pray to a corpse on a throne. They chant that he protects. They teach their children that service is holy and sacrifice is noble and suffering in his name is the highest honor. And somewhere in the Imperium's infinite bureaucracy, a requisition form exists with my name on it. Matthias Kale, Gear Tender 3rd Class, assigned to perpetual maintenance, service life, indefinite. The clock keeps perfect time. The pilgrims keep coming to marvel. The bells keep ringing every hour. And I keep screaming. My name was Matthias Kale. I have been screaming for 80 years. The tech priests tell me I might scream for 800 more. The Emperor protects, they said. They lied. In 17 minutes, the midnight bells will ring. In 17 hours, they'll ring again. In 17 years, they'll still be ringing, and I'll still be here to hear them, to feel them, to have them shatter what passes for my teeth and tear through what remains of my nervous system. A new tithe is scheduled for next month. The Cathedral needs 5 replacements for components that finally failed after 90-plus years of service. 5 boys will be selected from the underhive. 5 fathers will lose their sons. 5 chronometers might be worn on 5 wrists, ticking away the last seconds of 5 lives that will be measured from that point forward, not in days or years, but in the space between bells. I wonder if one of them will be wearing his father's chronometer. I wonder if one of them will stand where I stood 80 years ago, confused and terrified, being told this is an honor, while his legs are being measured for amputation. I wonder if one of them will hang in his gear for the first time and see me, see what 8 decades of service actually looks like, and understand in that moment that all the promises were lies. I wonder if he'll be able to see me at all, or if by then I'll have faded so completely into the mechanism that I'm invisible even to other components, just another piece of brass and wire and flesh too, amalgamated to distinguish. The viewing port is rotating into my sightline again. There's always someone at the viewing ports. Pilgrims come at all hours to witness the sacred chronometry. Right now, it's a tech worker from the mid-hive, his coveralls marked with the cog symbol of a manufactorum laborer, his face tired but reverent as he watches the gears turn. Does he know what he's looking at? Does he see the bodies integrated into the mechanism, or has his brain categorized us as part of the architecture, decorative elements in the Emperor's great design? Does he pray to a god who doesn't answer? Does he believe that the corpse on Terra sees his devotion and grants protection? Does he teach his children the litanies and think he's giving them spiritual armor against the horrors of the 41st millennium? Or does some part of him know, the way that child knew for a brief moment before his father corrected his perception, that the whole system is built on lies, that the gods are false, that the protection is propaganda, and that what he's witnessing isn't holy devotion but industrial-scaled torture masquerading as sacred service? I'll never know. The gear rotates me past the viewing port, and he's gone from my sight, and I continue through the darkness toward the next chime cycle. Somewhere in the Imperium, a war is being fought. Somewhere. Soldiers are dying in trenches, ships are burning in the void, worlds are being consumed by tyrannids, or enslaved by orcs, or corrupted by the warp entities that call themselves gods, but are just parasites in the immaterium feeding on human suffering. And somewhere on Metallica 7, in the Cathedral of St. Macarius, the unyielding, a clock keeps perfect time, its mechanism maintained by the nervous systems of boys who were told they were blessed and honored, and serving the Emperor's protection. The clock doesn't care about the wars. The clock doesn't care about the Imperium. The clock cares only about time, about measuring it with precision. about announcing each hour with 17 bronze bells that weigh several tons each and are specifically designed to resonate at a frequency that transmits perfectly through brass and steel and bone. And I care about nothing anymore except counting the minutes until the next chime, and then the minutes after, and then the minutes after that, in an infinite sequence that defines my existence more completely than my name or my memories or the ghost of the boy I used to be. 15 minutes now. My nervous system is already detecting the gear shifts that precede the chime sequence. The clock is preparing to strike midnight. My body is preparing to break again. This is my eternal purpose. To sense these preparations, to report them through neural interfaces, to cogitators that adjust for wear and temperature and 1,000 other variables, to serve as a living feedback system because my nervous system can detect mechanical anomalies faster than any sensor array the Mechanicus has designed. I am very good at my purpose. The tech priests were right about that. My efficiency rating is substantially above average, my integration more successful than most. In the machine's terms, I am an exemplary component. In human terms, I am a boy who was eaten by a clock 80 years ago and who will continue to be digested for centuries more. My consciousness preserved just enough to understand what I've become, but not enough to change anything about it. 10 minutes. The boy who was Matthias Kale, who watched the sky through a 30-centimeter window, who wore his grandfather's chronometer and believed his father when he said that time was the only thing truly his own, that boy is gone. Consumed. Integrated so thoroughly into gear assembly theta, 7 that there's no meaningful distinction between biological and mechanical anymore. What remains is awareness, trapped consciousness. The ghost in the machine, if you believe in such things, except I'm not haunting the mechanism. I am the mechanism, and the mechanism is me. And we turn together through the darkness, measuring time for pilgrims who will never know my name. 5 minutes. The other components are preparing too. I can sense them through the sympathetic vibration of the clock's structure, Marcus on theta. 4, the century-old components in the upper assemblies, the new integrations barely 3 months installed. We're all preparing. We're all waiting. We're all about to experience simultaneously what the Imperium means when it says eternal service. 2 minutes. My chronometer is still frozen at 3 hours, 9 minutes and 43 seconds. The hands haven't moved in 73 years. But I know what time it is. My body knows. My nervous system is screaming the information even before the conscious thought forms. Midnight. 17 strikes. Maximum duration. Maximum intensity. 1 minute. I close my eyes, one of the few voluntary movements I still have, and I think about my father. I wonder if he's still alive at 103 years old, or if the refinery fumes finally killed him decades ago. I wonder if he ever learned what happened to me, or if he died believing the lies, thinking his son was honored and blessed and serving the Emperor's great work. I hope he died believing the lies. I hope he never stood at a viewing port and saw what I became. 30 seconds. The gears shift into chime position. I feel it through every nerve ending, every wire, every point where flesh meets brass. The clock is ready. The bells are ready. I am ready. The way you're ready for anything that happens 17 times a day for 80 years. Not with acceptance or peace, but with the animal awareness that this is happening and there's nothing to do except endure it. 10 seconds. My name was Matthias Kale. I was 19 years old when they put me in this gear. I am 99 years old now, though my body is frozen at biological 30-something due to the electrical stimulation that keeps me functional. 5 seconds. The Emperor protects, they told me. The Omnicia provides, they told me. Your service is eternal and holy, they told me. They lied about all of it. 2 seconds. The only true thing they said was eternal. 1 second. The bells,